The economic calculation problem began in 1920 with an Austrian named Ludwig von Mises, who, much to the dismay of generations of utopians, dropped a logical nuclear bomb right in the middle of socialist theory. The title of his essay was plain enough: Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. The argument, however, was anything but. What Mises showed, calmly, rigorously, and with all the charm of an accountant auditing your dreams, is that without private property in the means of production, you cannot have market prices, and without market prices, you cannot have economic calculation, and without economic calculation, you don't have an economy. You have a cargo cult with spreadsheets. This wasn't just a criticism of Marxist inefficiency, it was an ontological challenge that rational planning, absent decentralized exchange and the price signals it produces, is not merely difficult, it is impossible in principle. You may still build cities, issue decrees, and allocate resources, but you're flying blind, making guesses in the dark and calling it governance. In short, what Mises proved, without slogans or sentiment, is that socialism doesn't just fail in practice, it fails by definition. And while later thinkers like Hayek would refine the argument, Mises had already pulled the curtain back. Behind the grand rhetoric of collective ownership and scientific planning, there was nothing but a blank stare. You can't plan what you don't understand, and you can't understand what you can't measure, and you can't measure without the very mechanism socialism abolishes. This is not a moral argument, by the way. It's a cognitive one. The central planner, no matter how wise, benevolent, well-intentioned, no matter how many PhDs or GPU clusters they possess, cannot know what needs to be known to allocate resources effectively. The information doesn't exist centrally. It is distributed and entangled in billions of unspoken preferences, implicit judgments, tacit behaviors, and shifting incentives. The market reveals these things through prices. Central planning guesses them through ideology. The economic calculation problem is not merely a critique of bad math. It's a proof of concept that says you literally cannot do the math. Not because you didn't go to MIT, but because the numbers aren't available in principle. Why? Because the only system that generates these numbers, market prices, disappears the moment you abolish private property. What the ECP lays out is that without a pricing system rooted in real exchange, you cannot allocate capital efficiently. You cannot determine opportunity costs. You cannot compare methods. You cannot know which production plan creates value and which destroys it. You're not doing economics anymore. You're doing industrial astrology. And to be very clear, Mises isn't asking the planner to perform miracles. He's merely observing that for any planner to engage in rational calculation, they would need complete information about every consumer preference, including how much they value each good compared to every other good right now and in the future, a detailed inventory of every resource on Earth, its quantity, quality, location, and usability, a full catalog of all known technologies, production functions, and transformation recipes, and perfect agreement among all decision makers on what exactly should be produced and how. That's not just hard. That's divine. We're not asking a planner to be competent, we're asking them to be omniscient, which means, of course, that in the absence of omniscience, planning becomes guesswork. To illustrate the point, Mises gives us a deceptively simple example. A director wants to build a house. So far, so good, but which method of construction should he choose? This is where the gaping black hole opens. Each method uses different materials, absorbs different labor, takes a different amount of time, produces a different quality of result. Maybe brick lasts longer but costs more. Maybe concrete is faster but uglier. Maybe bamboo is cheaper but collapses in a strong wind. How does the planner choose? How does he compare? He can't. Because there's no unit of account. He can't reduce all these variables into a single scale. There's no denominator, no way to say whether 10 days of labor is worth more or less than 5 tons of steel. Without prices, every decision is a conjecture. There's no math, no margin, no optimization, just vibes. And this isn't just a problem at the building level, this is everywhere. Without private property, you don't have natural prices for inputs. Without prices for inputs, you don't have prices for outputs. Without either, you can't calculate profit or loss. And without profit or loss, you can't measure anything. You don't know if your method is efficient, wasteful, better than the alternative, or worse. You're flying blind, blindfolded, and backwards. To summarize, no prices means no comparison. No comparison means no choice. No choice means no planning. No planning means you're not doing economics at all. You're cosplaying it with charts and flow diagrams. At that point, you're not allocating resources. You're assigning them like a dungeon master distributing loot. Now, if you're building a society that can't figure out how to produce a pencil without a 5-year plan and a prayer, don't be surprised when your resource allocation collapses into parity. If you can't compare inputs, you can't evaluate trade-offs. If you can't evaluate trade-offs, you can't coordinate production. And if you can't produce, then the debate is over. Whatever this is, it's not an economic system. It's just a very, very expensive form of performance art. Which leads us to the unspoken question: how can any society be preferable if it can't produce the goods its members need to survive? There's no economic metric, no utilitarian calculus, no social welfare function in which a system that can't calculate outperforms one that can. Economics is a consequentialist game. If your ideology leads to starvation, stagnation, or 10-year waiting lists for toilet paper, then no, it does not work in theory. This is why any critique of market anarchism that ignores the economic calculation problem is dead on arrival. You can't argue against decentralized exchange while skipping over the fact that it's the only known mechanism that generates real-time information about what people want, what things cost, and what is possible. You can object to its moral tone or its aesthetic messiness, but if you care about producing anything, you have to start with the ECP. Otherwise, you're basically just arguing with gravity. And once you do start there, you're left with a stark choice. Either you accept that economic knowledge arises from property, or you believe that centralized models and planning committees can divine this knowledge from pure theory or divine fiat. But if you believe the former, as every functioning economy on Earth does, then you'll find there's no pure instantiation of that logic than the market anarchist ideal: production and exchange governed entirely by voluntary, decentralized action, where knowledge lives at the level of the actor, not the algorithm. Of course, many have tried to refute the economic calculation problem, but not one has succeeded. The responses range from clever to confused to outright embarrassing, but none survive even cursory logical inspection. The first is the classic fallback of the engineer economist: linear programming. This supposedly solves the allocation problem through constraint optimization. Maximize this, minimize that, then shuffle the inputs until you hit the sweet spot. But linear programming assumes a static economy, an economic snow globe, not a living process. It's a solution that works only if nothing ever happens, and even then it only tells you how to optimize, not what you're optimizing for. It doesn't solve the core issue. How do you establish a quantitative relationship between factors of production? What unit do you use to compare one method to another? Linear programming doesn't even begin to answer the question. Then there's the old labor theory of value, dragged out of its Marxist mausoleum and dressed up as a solution to Mises. Let's calculate value in labor hours, they say. Equal input, equal output. But labor isn't a homogeneous thing. 1 hour of brain surgery is not the same as 1 hour of Uber Eats delivery. A neurosurgeon and a food courier may both work from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m., but only one of them is saving lives. Labor, like capital, is qualitative. It's not a common unit. It can't be used as a universal denominator without pretending that every human activity is exchangeable at a 1-to-1 ratio. You would need some interpersonal utility function to make these comparisons work. A way to crawl inside everyone's heads and rank their subjective preferences on a common scale. We don't have such a function. No one does. God doesn't. The labor hour solution fails not because it's morally offensive, but because it's intellectually incoherent. Then we arrive at the Lange model, often praised as the knockout blow to Mises. It's nothing of the sort. Lange's response isn't even socialist. It's neoclassical. It inherits the assumption of neoclassical economics, namely that capital is a smooth, homogeneous substance, like a beige liquid you just pour into the top of a production function. But capital in the real world is a chaotic zoo of distinct tools, machines, processes, and time structures. It's not a blob, it's a lattice, and the entire challenge of economic calculation is which lattice to use. Which configuration of inputs, each with its own cost and timing and durability, will yield the best result. You can't decide this without prices. Suppose you can build a widget using 5 units of A, 6 of B, and 3 of C, or with 2 units of A, 8 of B, and 4 of C. How do you choose? In a market, you look at prices. If A is expensive and B is cheap, you might choose the second method. But in a planned economy, there are no real prices, only guesses. The planner doesn't know which method is cheaper because there is no price system to tell him. Even if he did know, he would still need to decide how much to produce. But the demand curve is invisible, and marginal returns are unknown. In the absence of prices, there's no way to predict whether expanding production increases profit or is just waste. And what's Lange's great solution? Trial and error. Adjust parametric prices up or down until markets clear. If demand is too high, raise prices. If it's too low, drop them. Rinse and repeat. But this isn't a solution, it's just a simulation. It assumes the market is a thermostat, not a discovery process. Worse, it assumes that the planner will know when the price is right. But how do you know? In the market, success is profit. Profit tells you that your method is efficient. Loss tells you it's not. But in the Lange system, there's no such feedback. Trial and error only works when you have a way to recognize success. Without market prices for capital goods, you don't have that. As Mises wrote, it would be quite futile if the arithmetical process did not provide a yardstick for discriminating what is incorrect from what is correct. You cannot do trial and error without a ruler. You can't plan without a scorecard. You can't allocate without a signal. Next, we're told that Walmart has somehow solved the ECP. This is either deliberate confusion or just plain economic illiteracy. Walmart is not a planned economy. It's a logistics platform. It doesn't produce its goods, it distributes them. The ECP is about production. It applies to higher order goods, capital allocation, not shelf stocking. Walmart operates in a market. It has prices. It outsources production to market actors. It's not a planned economy. It's a market participant. If Walmart fails to allocate efficiently, it loses money. If the Politburo fails, it recalibrates the 5-year plan and blames the kulaks. And then we get the empirical rebuttals, the "look at the Soviet Union, they built tanks" argument. Yes, and they also starved millions, paved over economic signals, and survived only by copying prices from the West. The ECP is not an empirical question. It's not refuted by pointing to outputs. The question isn't whether a command economy can produce anything. It's whether it can produce rationally, whether it can know if it's creating value or destroying it. End of story. Other attempts, like the Cobb-Douglas production function, fail for the same reason. They don't provide a common unit. They're mathematical approximations that assume you already have price relationships. They don't generate those relationships. They're decorative, not functional. They restate the problem. They don't solve it. And participatory economics? This replaces planners with communal wish fulfillment rituals. People in neighborhoods vote on what should be produced, and somehow this information is turned into a coherent production plan. But the ECP isn't about democratic legitimacy. It's about whether you can allocate capital rationally. Voting doesn't create prices. It doesn't tell you if labor hours spent making hula hoops are more valuable than labor hours spent making wheelchairs. It doesn't solve the calculation problem. It just launders it through process. Same for the so-called quasi-market, where state planners try to mimic market incentives by pretending to care about profit. But there's no skin in the game, no bankruptcy, no real ownership, and no consequences. The ECP doesn't care if your planner wants to act like a capitalist. It cares whether the signals they respond to are generated by voluntary exchange. If not, it's still guesswork. And finally, we arrive at the most bewildered objection of all, the claim that the economic calculation problem somehow applies to markets themselves. This isn't just wrong, it's a category error. The ECP is defined by the absence of real prices for capital goods. In markets, prices aren't missing, they're central. That's their entire point. The ECP isn't just some floating critique you can aim in any direction. It's specifically an epistemological problem. How do you know what to produce, how to produce it, and in what quantity? In a market system, this knowledge emerges from decentralized exchange. Entrepreneurs place bets, consumers reveal preferences through choices, prices synthesize billions of micro decisions into actionable signals. Profit and loss act as the evolutionary forces that cull the inefficient and reward the efficient. In a centralized, planned economy, no knowledge like this ever materializes. There are no prices, no voluntary exchanges to generate them, no way to compare the cost of a ton of steel with the benefit of a school bus, no way to tell if using 1,000 labor hours to produce turnips instead of turbines is value creating or value destroying. You don't get feedback, you get spreadsheets, rationing, and slogans. You get economic necromancy dressed up in modern UX. You can't measure, you can't calculate, you can't decide. You can only guess. And when your guesses are wrong, as they inevitably will be, you don't get market correction. You get famine, or gulags, or 5-year plans to build tractors that no one asked for. The ECP isn't a technical glitch, it's a fundamental boundary on what can be known from the top down. It tells us that socialist and centrally planned economies aren't just inefficient, they're incapable of rational production. They don't just perform badly, they operate in permanent epistemic darkness. And once you grasp this, you're forced to accept the implications. If economic knowledge requires decentralization, voluntary exchange, and property-defined incentives, then the closer you get to those conditions, the closer you get to rational economic coordination. Which brings us to market anarchism. Market anarchism isn't utopia, it's simply the cleanest application of the principle that value must be discovered and enacted, not dictated. It rejects the pretense that a central mind can know what millions of individuals in specific times and places want, need, or are willing to trade. It builds from the ground up, not the top down. It doesn't simulate exchange, it is exchange. And for that reason, it doesn't suffer from the ECP, it circumvents it. So if you're serious about economic rationality, if you're not just playing house with other people's stuff, there's really no debate left to have. The ECP doesn't tell you everything about how economies should work, but it tells you one thing with mathematical certainty: central planning doesn't.